everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me, as always, are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hello, Mr. Perry Cruz. It's your lovable friend, Jackie.
And hey, it's me, Diana.
Jackie, you sound like the bad guy from The Matrix. Mr.
I'm being the bad guy from The Bad Guys.
But they weren't that bad.
No, they were
Spoiler
good.
alert, they became good.
I know. I'm reading the books right now. I'm on number 8.
They're pretty fast reads.
Yeah.
They're like comic books, and they're 80 pages
I'm not
long.
reading them for myself, obviously.
Oh, obviously.
You could.
Yeah, that's true. I could, but I'm not. And I watched the movie. Very different from the books.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
I didn't read the books.
Oh.
I only partially watched the movie.
Fair.
Yeah. Anywho, this isn't a podcast about children's entertainment. It's a podcast.
But it could be. It could be at which movie and or book do you want to use, the book or the movie? You can choose, but they're both available to you.
Oh. Well, they're not freely available. You have to pick one and then present one. So you have to like put out a copy of the DVD and put out a copy of the book. And then if the child picks one, then you're like, great, let's go try that one. And let them watch like a couple seconds or hear a couple pages, then take it away and do it all again. And then once they finally are like, I hate this, please just give me the blank, then you know which one is the best way for your child to experience at least The Bad Guys. But this isn't a podcast about child entertainment reviews.
You did that part.
I already did that part, but then I was interrupted, so I got to go back to this is a podcast about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research, where every week we pick a topic and discuss some relevant research articles. And this week we're doing a topic that we probably could have done a long time ago, and we certainly mentioned at various times throughout our 270
I'll tell you
plus
all about
episodes.
it in pairings.
But we have never just specifically talked about it, and that is concurrent chains arrangement, which is fascinating because I think it is a topic that is really kind of had a big comeback in the past few years in terms of discussions of assent and how do we pick the best treatments when we're not just looking at the efficacy of treatments. So I think it's a very important one. I'm glad it's been coming up a lot more in the past decade or so, but it predates, I think, Greg Hanley's sort of publication on how we can use concurrent chains in preference assessments of treatment, pretty much. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of those original experimental behavior research studies. And then we're going to get into why it's back in the zeitgeist and talk a little bit about how you might want to use a concurrent chains arrangement in some of your treatment planning.
Back again. Concurrent chains.
Tell a friend. Oh, boy. So, Diana, what articles are we going to be rapping about today?
Oh, that's why you keep me around. Okay, fine. I'll tell you. We're going to talk about 4 different articles today in the context of this conversation, and they include, in no particular order, Toward Effective and Preferred Programming, a case for the objective measurement of social validity with recipients of behavior change programs. That was written by Hanley and published probably around the year 2010 in BAP.
Phew.
Also,
You left us hanging there. We're like, where was it published?
well, because I don't know the year, you know that it was BAP.
It was 2010.
Yeah, okay. A review of the concurrent chains arrangement to assess intervention choice, 2018 to 2023, by Outen, Van Camp, and Ferguson. That was published in JABA 2024.
It just came into my mailbox.
Newly formatted page for Java. Looks different. Is that because it's a discussion paper or because they changed the format?
The Java volumes have become like larger, like physically larger, not necessarily thicker, but they sort of go less of the book size, like a kind of a one of those sort of, fancy paperbacks, like an Oprah's paperback club. And now they're sort of these like really large, more magazine style sizes.
Interesting.
I love that
It's going to look bad on a shelf.
You have the actual copy.
I do. I still get it. I don't know why.
You put them right next to all your Oprah book club.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I can't now because they're all different sizes. It's terrible.
We got Oprah, then we've got Java, then we've got Reese Witherspoon's book clubs on the other side.
Yep.
So that we get the whole mix.
And the Pioneer Woman cookbooks on the other side of that. Preference for free choice over forced choice in pigeons by Catania and Segvolden. That was in Journal of Experimental Analysis of Behavior, JAB, 1980. A great year to be born.
Our birth years.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, a comparison of written, vocal, and video feedback when training teachers by Luck, Lehrman, Wu, Dupuy, and Hussein. And that was in the Journal of Behavioral Education 2018. Get ready.
Yes. Well, before we start talking a little bit more about what concurrent chains arrangements are, I wanted to read everyone a poem. It's not my poem. This is a Charlie Catania poem published in the most recent issue of Operants. So Q4 2023 issue. Those, if you do not subscribe to the Skinner Society, you can subscribe and get Operants every quarter. And they write a lot of interesting pieces. Sometimes they're very technical. Sometimes they're more think pieces or essays, interviews.
One of the only places you could get your poetry published, I would think, in the behavior analytic world.
Maybe they're moving into, fantasy fiction with behavior analysis. Maybe that's a new avenue. I know friend of the show, D2 Dr. Roger Rahman, he had a nice piece in the last Operants about choice. It was all about choice.
Oh, there's good stuff in there.
It was really fun.
Oh, yes.
Really fun. But this poem was one, I'm not sure if Dr. Catania had written this poem. I can't remember if he'd written it specifically and then thought it would be funny and then they decided to put it in the journal, or if this was something he had kicking around and he'd sort of share with colleagues and then thought this might be fun to put in this. I can't remember the exact origin, but here it is. It's called The Key Not Chosen. It borrows liberally from a different poem you might also know. Two keys emerged in the pigeon's view, and wary it couldn't peck on both. Though clear that one was less than two, it stood transfixed by what to do. And to peck further it seemed loath. The one and other were just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim because it was glassy and had less wear. It eyed the left while quite aware of outcomes really about the same. And both that session equally lay to tempt the bird. It had stepped back. It might peck either on another day. Yet knowing how each peck leads on the way, I doubted if it should ever come back. I should have known it would not stand by zero behavior, made no sense. Two keys remained and it broke the tie. It pecked the right. No reason why. And that hasn't made much difference.
That's actually really good.
Yeah, it is.
It makes me really mad when people are very good at lots of things.
Oh, yeah?
Like that Dr. Catania is a scientist, but also a poet.
He's a true Renaissance man. Right. Well, it is, clearly done in the very borrowed style of Robert Frost.
But still, it's good.
Let's say
It is a really good adaptation.
It's very good. This is the classy podcast because we start with a poem.
Yeah.
And now let's continue with a journal article. Let's take it back. Speaking of Dr. Catania's many accomplishments, let's take it back to 1980 and look at where these concurrent chains arrangements sort of came from. I mean, so certainly it's just, another schedule of reinforcement. And most folks now think of it as, concurrent chains, the thing you use for preference assessments around treatment. But that wasn't why it was sort of developed as a technology, or described, I should say, as a technology. It came from pigeon studies, and it's sort of been repurposed.
So as a reminder for all of our newer listeners, a concurrent chain is a schedule of reinforcement that consists of two components arranged in a sequence, and during the choice link, the participant has two alternatives available simultaneously, so they can choose either. And each of them could have different or similar schedules of reinforcement, but usually the terminal links are different, meaning the outcome is different, right? Cool. So this article it's a short one. Mm-hmm. It's like a meaty 10 pages. Mm-hmm. And I think the only reason that people find this article a little bit scary is because the graphs are not graphed in a way that we typically see graphs graphed. And so I'll talk about that in a little bit. But I actually love this article and make my students read it every year for the past 10 years because, it's really old. So as old as me. I mean,
as old as us.
Yeah.
As old as me. And so it's fun to see different types of graphs. So, yeah, go ahead, Rob.
Oh, I was going to say, I tend to, when I don't mind reading JAB articles when they're from, 30 or 40 years ago, and they're like highly cited, and everyone knows that article, because then I feel like I can skip some of the details that I feel like get lost in. Like, wait, how many pigeons? Wait, how are they labeling these things? I don't know. Like, why are they all these different numbers? It's not like, single subject design with participants. And I sort of just focus on tell me, author, what you were doing, and I'm going to read the text and I'll try to look at the graph, and I'm like, I think maybe okay, and I'll just keep going and just
You go like this.
It's more like a historical curio.
Yeah.
I know it's a little lazy, but at the same time, I'm also never going to be a basic researcher, and it's not like this just came out and it's like, well, we should be skeptical about results till we've seen them published over and over. This is an older article. We've seen this replicated many times. I think being a little sloppy is not gonna hurt.
Yeah. So I'm not gonna be sloppy though.
No, that's good. And that's why you got to sign this article, and I'm not talking about it.
Yeah. So this article really came about, I'm assuming, from a late night discussion on whether organisms value freedom, right? There's always this discussion in behavior analysis when we talk about free will and determinism. I can never say that word without adding that in it. I'm not sure why. And so they were like, okay, we can't really tackle that really complex question of free will versus determinism with humans, right? Because there's so many other variables that are at play, and we can't like take a baby from birth, right, and then use them as an experiment.
No, not ethically, no.
No, we can't. And I mean, it would bring some Stranger Things, right? Stranger Things.
TV show?
Yeah.
Oh.
Stranger Things TV show.
Yeah.
When 9 was stuck in the basement. 11. Yep. I knew it was a number. And so they were like, hey, but we can do this with pigeons. So let's see. And so what they tried to do and assess how organisms value freedom is through concurrent operance arrangements. So they looked at free choice versus forced choice. And they wanted to look, does this only apply to humans? Is it a project of ontogeny, meaning ontogenic selection, or operant conditioning, right?
Learned within your lifetime.
Yep, the level 2 of selection, or phylogeny, which is the phylogenetic selection, or level 1, where it's at the genes and genetic expression.
Yes.
Right? And as a reminder, the 3 levels of selections are phylogeny, ontogeny, and cultural or sociocultural, depending the 3rd level. Yep. So just like a little BACB quiz right there. Okay, so they also looked at different alternatives here. So they looked at free choice, they looked at forced choice, they looked at stimulus conditions when they were equated, when the stimuli were varied, and when they gave the pigeons a little bit of information. I like what they said. Specific bits of information is what they said. And so they wanted to figure out when free choice was preferred over forced choice. So free choice looked like there was 3 green keys and a red key. And if the pigeon picked on any of the green keys on an FI schedule, they received a pellet of food pellet. And with the forced choice, there were 3 red keys and 1 green key. And if they choose the red keys, just like before, nothing happened. But if they chose that 1 green key on a FI schedule, same schedule of reinforcement, they received the pellet. Right? So they had 4 of my favorite pigeons, the white Carnu pigeons. They were about a year old, and they were 90% of their free feed body weight. I was thinking about this, and if I was a human, I would be so hungry.
90%'s in the realm of these types of studies is good.
No, it is.
Yeah.
It definitely is, but I was just imagining how hungry I would be. That's why the pigeon is responding, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Because they're a little bit hungry. They're not like super hungry.
It's easy to set up motivation in these studies because you have restricted access.
Right. So anyway, late night was Jackie McDonald thinking about how hungry I would be. People restricting my food.
Great.
Okay.
So if I'm a pigeon, I'm hopping in and I'm either seeing 3 green options, 1 red option. The red option does nothing. And the green options all do the same thing.
Yes.
But I can choose which one I pick on.
Yep.
Or I'm hopping in and I'm seeing 3 red options. Again, I guess I could pick one of them, but they all do nothing. And only 1 green option, which produces the same access to the same schedule of reinforcement access, but I only have 1 to pick from.
Yep.
Okay.
And other things too, but we'll get there when we talk about the apparatus.
Okay. I'm in my pigeon mode.
Oh, you're in your pigeon mode. Okay.
Yeah.
So prior to the study, all of the pigeons were trained to peck both the red and green keys. So that's important to note. And hilariously, all of them peck more red keys than green keys.
Interesting.
So going into the study, they've had a history of reinforcement with the red keys and the green keys, but they liked the red keys better. Okay.
And pigeons are wicked good at discriminating by color.
Oh my gosh. So good.
Yeah.
Don't have to worry about that, everyone. You should read that article where they look at Monet and Picasso paintings and they flip them.
We should talk about that article.
We should talk about that
article.
Yeah, we should. Okay, so they're in the apparatus, right? There are 6 keys. There are 4 keys that have color, 2 keys that are white. The upper keys were the green and red keys that Diana talked about. The keys on the lower side, there's 2 whites. In the terminal link, so once you press a button, you see it goes dark for 2 seconds, and then you see more, right? In the terminal link, it represents force choice in these first couple of sessions, and if they hit the right, it's represented by free choice, right? Once the schedule was delivered, or once the schedule was met, food was delivered. So.
Okay, so when I'm hopping in, I'm just picking right side white key,
Not
left
yet.
side.
Nope.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so when you're hopping in, you are the colored keys are going to be dark, and the white keys are going to be pressed.
Yes.
Right, but you can't see the colors.
That's what I just said. Yes.
Oh, did you?
Yes.
Sorry, I didn't hear you, I guess.
Right.
And then you're just pecking some white keys on a VI 30 schedule, and then once you hit the criteria for the white keys, then the red key, then the colored keys show up.
Got it.
Yep. So terminal link was scheduled for the second peck after the changeover, and that predict the access to the terminal link. Remember, the left side in the beginning was the force choice, and the right side was the free choice. And yeah, and then after each link was presented independently of responding, then the things came up, and then the schedule was met, and then the food was delivered. Yep. So
the only difference was whether they could pick which green key they pecked to get the food, but the schedule was the same.
Was the same in this first part, right?
Yeah.
But throughout the sessions, I'm not going to talk about it a ton because they didn't really talk about it a ton, but over the sessions, they mixed up the free and forced choice. So sometimes it was on the right, sometimes it was on the left to make sure that there wasn't a side bias. They increased the session durations for forced choice or free choice, and then free choice and then not forced choice to see if that changed everything. They changed the FI from a 10-second to a 30-second and made one more advantageous than the other, and then switched and made the other one more advantageous. And then they also adjusted the reinforcer duration, so the amount of time that pellets would come down and the pigeon could eat. So they tried to look at all sorts of things, right? And then they also wanted to make sure that the odd colored key varied across sessions and conditions and where it was. They had a specific pre-programmed conditions. There was like A, A, B, C, C, A, C, I, A, right? So we don't need to really talk about that.
It looks like genetic coding.
It does. But it created a non-repeating sequence of an odd key in each terminal link. So they also made sure that, just like in preference assessments, right, you don't want to make sure that one person's always on the left or one item's always on the left and one's always on the right. They did that. They also noted they examined response rates and stimulus control on the initial link, and the most pigeons preferred key 1 and most pigeons did not prefer key 3, surprisingly. They just wanted you to know that there was this
very thorough.
There was this preference before you saw responding. Differentiate. Okay.
So many permutations.
They also wanted to let you know that there were some key failures that were detected, but they were very quick, they were short, and it didn't seem to deter responding. And in the article, they give you every instance of a key failure.
Wow.
Yeah, they're like session 1 at 2 seconds, session 5. So,
and that's just the thing broke down. The machine broke down. I was reading through, I was like, key fail, like the pigeon messed up or something. And then I realized, oh no, they're just talking about our machine we built ourselves broke.
yeah, it just broke. Sometimes that happens, right?
It was the 70s, man.
Yeah. And they made a machine. That's like kind of amazing.
I know you really did know a lot more kind of electrical engineering
Right?
to be a behavior analyst back then.
Yeah.
Okay.
And they were making these graphs by.
Yes, they were making, that's probably why they're a little fun. Okay, so in figure 2, you are looking at the relative initial link response rate during the preliminary conditions. And so here's where it gets wonky because the sessions are on the y-axis and the relative initial link rate is on the x-axis. So the first time you look at that, you're like, what is happening? And they look at the mean across sessions. So it's like sessions 1 through 8, 9 through 32, 33 through 41. So that also gets a little funky, right? And here, where the arrows are pointing matter, and where their shift, like where the line shifts, also matter. So a shift to the left corresponds to increasing performance for the left terminal link, and a shift to the right corresponds to the increasing preference for the right terminal link. So the filled left are free choice in the left terminal link, and the unfilled right are free choice in the right terminal link, right? So the arrows matter here. So when you see that and you understand that, you're like, oh, okay, so I see that here, just without any changes, there is more preference for free choice over forced choice on both terminal links when they're switched, right? And then they look at all the changes. They look at the choice, the position, if there's a high rate or a low rate. Again, the sessions are on the y-axis, and that relative initial link is on the x-axis. And what they found here is that there really wasn't, you couldn't change anything around to shift the preference from free choice over forced choice. Even if there was a higher rate of reinforcement on forced choice, pigeons still preferred the free choice. If they had varied stimuli, they still preferred the free choice. And so the preference shifted from left to right when free choice switched from left to right.
Yes.
And manipulating the placement of that odd key that they talked about earlier had no effect. So what we can say is that this study suggests, using a concurrent operance arrangement, that preference of free choice over forced choice is valued with pigeons, and it's not correlated with terminal link positions, position preferences, or relative rates of terminal link responding, because they looked across all of that and changed it all up, and they saw they changed everything.
Like, no.
The pigeon's like, this is what I prefer. I prefer free choice, right? And then they said that the pigeon learned to switch preference when they switched the terminal links. So preference here can be described ontogenically, right? Because it was learned during this few sessions. But they also said that preferences could also be described phylogenically, because there might be an evolutionary advantage for preferring free choice, right? Because there's just more options in case that one option suddenly, is gone, right?
Would that be a lesson to all the children listening there? Only eat one food. It's better to have a lot of options.
But yeah.
Eat your vegetables, kids.
So I think this is a real fun article to read, and they give you a graph, right? They give you how many times the pigeons pecked with varied positions on each key. I don't think we really need to go into that. But I think it's a really cool article to examine.
Very detailed.
Yeah, very, very detailed. Examine how concurrent chains, the arrangement can help us distinguish preference and the value of choice.
Yeah.
Cool.
So it sets us up with this whole idea of the initial, it's a multiple schedule, right, Jackie?
Yes, it's a multiple schedule because there is this one. Well, you don't have two schedules that are. Oh, they do.
Well,
the white one. Yeah.
Yeah,
It is
do.
a multiple schedule. Yep.
Yeah. Or sometimes the initial schedule, it's like an FR1.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it sets us up with that whole arrangement. So we have an initial link where there's two or more choices. Selection upon that link on whatever schedule it's available on will then determine what the next schedule that becomes available is. And so in this study, they were just evaluating like the choice options, but you could have that second reinforcement schedule be set up in all sorts of other ways, or it might not even be a reinforcement schedule. It could be some other aspect of the environment that's being evaluated for preference.
Yeah.
Which leads us now into what we're going to talk about next. So that's why it's important to understand like this entire setup as a means of evaluating lots and lots of different things. And the beauty of that is that you don't have to have vocal language in order to evaluate preference using this type of schedule arrangement.
Yeah. So kind of moving way ahead into the 2010s. And the Hanley 2010 article in BAP around effective and preferred programming, which is an article I have seen cited so many times that I think I forgot that I actually had never read it until getting ready for this episode. I either read the original articles that are referenced in which the concurrent chains
Yes.
arrangements were used to identify preference, or follow-up articles that cited this article to talk about the importance of assent and assessing social validity for clients who might not have the communication skills to be able to fill out, your Likert scales or the things we usually use for social validity measurements. And so it was really nice to get a chance to read this, because this isn't a research article in the sense of, here's the study we did. It's a think piece article that then references other research articles, which I'm always a big fan of, unless there's too many of them, in which case then they become a lot to read and you don't necessarily have results. So we tried to mix it up here. So in this article, really the focus is on, hey, everybody, social validity, we know it's important. It's been important forever. It's been talked about. We've had episodes on it ourselves, and how sort of the idea of what social validity is or could be or should be has changed since Wolf in 78. And this is really just kind of that next step of, it's nice to know the social validity of our treatments, because if you don't have social validity, nobody cares about the science that you're able to provide. Nobody cares about efficacy when everyone hates the overall package that you're offering to them. And even worse, we need to know what our clients are interested in when it comes to treatments. However, many of them are not able to fill out a form to say how much they loved our FCR program or our response blocking plus FCR program or whatever it is. And there's a good quote in here that efficacy without adequate social acceptability is a recipe for marginalization. So we need to be able to both get social validity measures of stakeholders and individuals who are able to communicate through written or vocal means, but it is equally important, if not more important, to get some measure of preference for our treatments, for the treatments that we're recommending from clients. And hey, says Hanley, what if we look at concurrent chains arrangements, just like the one that Catania and Sackfolden looked at in the 80s, or the 70s and 80s. So that's pretty much what this article is. It sort of sets a stage of why this is important, and then gives some examples of how it could be used. And then has a nice little FAQ about, if you're interested in learning more at your local library, here's some tips that you might want.
Right. Well, that was definitely the style of BAP at the time.
Yeah, it really was.
I do like when someone says, here's an article, read this. Now you can do this because I gave you the steps. That is always nice.
That was the whole idea of BAP.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it still does that to some extent. I think it's a lot more think pieces though, which can be fun. But then you'll get two think pieces in a row, and you're like, no, I already read a think piece on this. What's the show me the data that came?
Well, the special issues are kind of like that, but they're both filling an important need in our field.
Mm. Oh yeah, I don't want to. Yeah, I hope it doesn't sound like I was scrapping on any of those special issues. They're a lot of fun to read. Just you might not be able to read every single one at once. You got to kind of pick and choose, and then come back and think about it some more, and then come back, think about it some more. So in terms of this, Jackie already talked about sort of what the concurrent chains arrangement is going to be. We have our initial links, but the difference here versus with the pigeons, well, actually, it's not that different. It would be the same idea of choose the link by sort of making sure that when you're doing your treatment evaluations, you have some sort of signal in the environment of which procedure is in place. So, usually it's kind of, there's a colored poster board, or the experimenter has a colored shirt on or something, and that's treatment A. And then if you're running treatment B, say you're doing alternate, treatments design, to sort of see which of these two treatments that you think will be effective are actually effective for resolving whatever the behavioral excess might be. In these cases, have a different color. And then once you know that you have multiple treatments to choose from that are efficacious, i.e. they do what you want them to do, then you give your client or the student a chance to pick. They pick either the color card or a micro switch in some cases with matching colors. So I picked red. Well, red was associated with my FCR treatment. I picked blue. Blue is associated with my NCR treatment. Then you go into a room and you do whatever the correlated treatment was briefly, and that's our terminal link. And you just do this over and over until a choice pattern emerges. And therefore, you have an objective measure of this is the client's preference for the procedure without any need for language skills. Certainly, if you had language skills, you could do the same thing. You probably do, written cards, and we're actually going to talk about an example of that at the end of the episode. But, there's lots of ways you could sort of modify this for different types of learners, people with different communication styles. But at the end of the day, you have a preference that is preferred. Now, you're not just judging your treatments on, well, this one worked the best. You're also judging it on, and everyone loved this one the best. And this is pretty important because, well, if you don't have social validity for treatments, we know that treatments tend to just not be used. Oh, thank you for your help, behavior analyst. Please leave now. We're never going to use your treatment, even though you demonstrated how useful it was to us. We hate it, so we're not doing it. So Hanley shares some examples from his own research, sort of looking at a comparison of FCT for attention and NCR. So just, scheduled delivered attention. They both worked. And when they let the children choose, the children chose functional communication more. And then the article gets into some other fun things, similar to Catania and Sagvold, in that people like choice, it seems, more often than not. And we've done episodes on that as well. We'll talk about impairings, as well as the idea that sometimes individuals will choose treatments that objectively, our values might say, well, punishment. We should never use punishment unless we have to. But he brings up a study in 2005, Hanley, Piazza, Fisher, and Magliari, where FCT was ineffective, but FCT in punishment was effective. And the clients actually chose FCT and punishment over FCT and over punishment alone. So the idea of, well, we never want to use aversive unless we have to, may not be an appropriate stance to take, because we're talking about our values, which may not be the values of our clients and stakeholders. Again, not that one should, therefore we should use punishment all the time. But it's very closed-minded to say, well, I only use these treatments, because who cares what you only use? What's important is effectiveness and client preference. And the excuse of like, well, I don't know how I would ever find out what my client prefers, it's not really applicable. It hadn't been applicable before, but after articles like this came out, it's like, listen, there's ways to do this. You can't just sort of make these assumptions and say, well, I wish I could do more. Well, if you do, then your wish has been granted. You can. They give another example of a group-oriented concurrent chains assessment where there was sort of a probabilistic chance, like all the kids would vote on like, which treatment do you want to use? I think it was when you break the rules, do you want to hear about the rules? Do you want to practice or an alternate behavior, or do you want to have timeout and then do all that stuff? And all the kids would sort of pick which one they wanted for their playtime, and they put a little chip in a bag, and then the teacher would pull one out and say, oh, this is the one that won. And they sort of did this over and over. And, they found that they were able to get a decent preference of 2 having no preference and 2 actually having a preference. So, okay, great. Now we know which treatment we're going to use, because 2 kids don't care that much and 2 kids do. So let's do that one because, it also was effective. So it's important to be thinking about individuals as individuals with individual preference that don't necessarily match our preferences. And if we use this, then we're able to really listen to our clients in a way that we may not have before. So there's lots of ways to do it. And there's a little FAQ, which goes over, here are some things to keep in mind when you're setting up your concurrent chains arrangement, because you're not doing it in a pigeon box, because the keys break all the time. We need to have a different way.
And then you don't have to say, like, for 5 seconds, the key did not turn.
Isn't it so much easier sometimes when you're working with humans? So an FAQ, which kind of goes into how do you set this up? Well, you want to make sure you have 3 options, 2 that are going to be your target behavior change procedures of interest. So again, based on your FA, based on the function, these treatments should work based on the literature. And since they should work, why don't we make sure they work? And while we're doing that, why don't we give the client a chance to sort of pick between them? So you want to have 2 target behavior change procedures and then a control, which is really just sort of like there's no reinforcement to it. So go ahead, pick it. Nothing really special happens. It's kind of just boring. And this is going to help you know the difference between a client who doesn't really care, like, I like both of these treatments, they're just so great, or a client who has not been able to discriminate what the different colors or switches mean, like which treatment they are going to lead to. So you're going to start there. You want to make sure that you have some sort of discrete and easily prompted initial link response that isn't highly preferred. So again, does the client have a preferred color or a preferred means of sort of, they like certain cards versus other cards? You want to make sure it's kind of just a neutral stimulus you're using to signal, hey, I want to go into the, treatment A or treatment B or the control. You have to randomize the position of your initial link, because again, if you put it on the same side, there might be a side bias that is not the same as a preference for a treatment. You want to make sure that it's the same person, same reason, delivering the behavior change procedure. So you can't have 2 different people doing 2 different treatments, because again, how do you know that they don't just prefer one therapist over the other?
Because they might.
And you need to make sure that your terminal link duration is long enough so that the client experiences what is different about the 2 treatment options. And in the literature at that point, it was about 2 to 20 minutes that they would experience the terminal link. So it's going to vary based on what your treatment is. An FCT or an NCR, you could probably yoke those schedules and do a shorter repetitions. If you don't have access, I think everyone assumes you have some sort of like amazing waiting room where the client comes in and they flip a micro switch and then they go into one of, 2 different options of room where everything's set up so nicely and you go in there and do the treatment. But you could do this in one room. It's just one part of the room is the initial link section, and then bam, get your colored poster up, throw on your t-shirt, whatever you want to do to make it more discriminable, and then you run your treatment kind of on the other side of the room. So you don't need to, you certainly don't need to have some sort of elaborate setup for this. Though again, if you can get one, great.
You could use a shower curtain,
right?
Set up, right? Like when you're in like the doctor's office and they have that curtain.
The privacy
curtain. The illusion
curtain?
of privacy. Yeah. You could create one of those scenarios.
Oh, yeah. If you can make a little room, go for it. And then when you're graphing results, you want to graph each initial link choice cumulatively. And then at some point, you should see a difference in responding, developing for one of the choices. That's sort of how you know you're done. And if you're not getting that, again, out of control. If you haven't, maybe do fewer trials per day. That part is sort of like, oh man, it's hard enough to do this all the time consistently with your treatments in a lot of settings. So if you're doing it one trial a day, like I don't know how you're ever going to finish this procedure. Or you just look at, okay, what's different about the terminal link states? Like, can we make things more varied while keeping the core components of the treatments in place? So add more things in the environment perhaps, or the different types of tasks being presented. I suppose you could do all sorts of things, but it has to be whatever the treatment program has to keep its core components. Otherwise, it starts losing any value as a choice-making procedure. So,
wow,
this sets the stage for everything that came next. So let's take a break and then talk about all that next, shall we? We'll be right back.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there!
And we are back talking about the concurrent chains arrangement. Would it be a concurrent chains arrangement if you turned on your podcast player and then you see all the different podcasts you could choose, and then you click it, and then it takes you to a podcast, and then you listen to it for a couple seconds saying, I don't know, and you go back to the other one, you check, and you keep going until you have a preference for this is the podcast I want to finish listening to. And it's hopefully ours.
Yes.
Yep.
Or
Wow.
a murder podcast.
No, get out of here, murder podcast. ABA Inside Track all the way, especially because ABA Inside Track is ACE and Quava approved, unlike those murder podcasts, which are only murder approved. By listening to our show, unlike a murder show, you're able to earn a learning credit. Ooh, ah. All you need to do is finish listening. So again, don't keep doing your initial terminal links with your podcast players. You want to get through this episode fully, and then go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, or click the link in your podcast player. And then you can head to, that'll take you right to the page. You'll be able to enter all the information you need, including the 2 secret code words that are hidden in the episode. It's like a game and an educational source. How fun. The first of those code words is hero. H-E-R-O. Hero. It's like somebody of yore who did a great task.
I actually have something to say regarding that. So,
Okay.
you know, when you're like on the like splash page for whatever streaming service you use, and you just keep going back and forth and looking at different things that you could watch, right? Or read the description of them, that it has a name, and Rob should know this because he does this all the time, and his brother too, but it's called playing Menu Hero.
Oh, yes, I know that.
Yes. And so that's just like your other example of going through and like reviewing your podcast choices. It's reviewing all of your video choices, and it's called Menu Hero. Boom, tied it in.
Oh, well, then if we look at concurrent chains arrangements, that means that pretty much everything on Netflix is non-preferred by me because I keep going back to that initial link and nope, I can't discriminate between all of these terrible choices.
You should watch Irish Wish.
Yeah, that sounds like a real winner.
I was going to want
Oh, is it like Darby O'Gill and the Little People?
It is with
Emma Stone?
no,
No.
nope, Lindsay Lohan, and it is a rom-com that I did watch.
I did not.
And I actually made my young child watch it with me too because it was PG, so I knew there wouldn't be any like X-rated season. She's like, "What are we watching?" I'm like, "Oh, it's just a mommy's favorite." It was so bad, it was good.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Those are not my choices either.
No. Sometimes we just choose to turn off the TV when Irish Wish is the only option. It's very discriminable. Oh no, Lindsay Lohan, click. I'm out of here.
I saw a thing that said, "What would if you knew the world was going to end in 5 minutes? What would be the last song you listened to?" Just and the person responded saying, "I would just spend 5 minutes trying to pick a song."
That's awesome.
Oh boy. Not enough time to find your preference of song. Anyway, hero. What we're talking about? Hero's the code word.
Okay, it's my turn. I'm going to tell you about the Outen et.
I love when one of us does it. It's my turn. Like, oh, enough talking of our other hosts. Get out of here. It's my turn
You
to talk
guys are
about the
finally
article.
done. It's my chance to shine. This article just came out. It was like so recent, and it was an updated review of the concurrent chains arrangement literature that's existing out there in the ABA world. They just did the last 5 years. So if you want to go back before that, Ferguson et al. Did another one that was published in like 2018, I think.
Old. It's old stuff.
Old
Who cares
news.
anymore?
Yeah,
Let's
so
get to
these
the
are
new
just
stuff.
the last 5 years. So if you're like, wait, I know of a different concurrent chains arrangement because there are several that in the Hanley camp, those were all covered before. So this is just that time period. But they found that when Ferguson did this, I'm sorry, it was 2019. When they did it, only 13 out of the 1,209 studies that they reviewed used a concurrent chains procedure. So that was only 1%. And this go around, they used some of the same criteria. They just specifically were looking at concurrent chains, not concurrent operands. So with concurrent operands, you have multiple opportunities to respond on several schedules that are available, but the concurrent chains arrangement is the one that has that specific initial link selection component. So they were just looking at concurrent chains. When they did that, they ended up with 44 articles this go around. So one would assume that was slightly higher percentage, but it's still not a lot. There are not a lot of concurrent chains out there in the literature. They found that 31 of these comparisons were for interventions with skill acquisition aspects, and about 13 were comparisons of interventions for challenging behavior, so variations there. So for the skill acquisition, for example, people were looking at things such as prompting variations, reinforcement schedules that were available for skill acquisition type things, types of feedback, token schedule options, manned or tact training options, physical activity, preference, and praise delivery, just as a few examples. Many of them were a variation on those themes. And then the challenging behavior interventions included comparisons and preference for things such as FCT, DRA, NCR, RARD, the effective preference assessments on subsequent compliance with activities, pairing, and accumulated versus distributed reinforcement schedules as some ideas. So if you're wondering how one would ever do this, those are the types of things that people are currently evaluating. So they took those 44 studies and they looked at, again, they had two lovely tables that broke them down in the ways I just described. And then they went on to say, here are some emerging themes that we see / continued areas for future research.
They should give a prize, I think, to individuals who write these sorts of review papers, and then they have these great tables of, do you want to read these articles? Look, there they are. You can look at all the variations, and we did all the putting them in a table for you work. Just like best table deserves
I think
more recognition than it gets.
Best table.
Best table.
Yeah, why don't we have those at the end of the year?
I don't
The
know, everything's,
Abbeys.
everything's for like, oh, who's the best like new idea, or who's the best at like
Best
saving
table.
the world? But where's our best table? Come on,
Yeah.
groups.
I think the prize is often partial fulfillment of a master's degree.
And or
maybe-
PhD.
And
You know
or
what?
PhD.
Let's add that. Put it in the notes for the 2024 year in ABA best table. We're doing that. That's ours now.
Okay.
We'll send the
right
winners
now,
a certificate.
Right now, I would say best table was Dr. Malika Pritchard's review.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that was a good
Of-
one.
4 of those. So it may not be eligible for this year's award.
Oh,
Maybe
okay.
we'll do the first one could be a historical table, and then
It
everyone's
was a
got
historical table,
No, I
actually.
mean, like we'll look at all sorts of years, like the past 5 years or
okay.
something.
Well, in case anyone's wondering, that was a reference to she was looking at ethical like things that happened in psychology and then in behavior analysis as a timeline thing. It was a really, really great table. I think it's in a book chapter though.
Oh, it's been disqualified, even though it's a
I'm
great
so
table.
sorry. Yes, you're out of the running.
Make
So
up better rules.
emerging themes for this in the realm of concurrent chains arrangements included were they evaluating client preference versus caregiver and staff preference. So 39 of these 44 studies looked at client preference. So that was assessing preference for what they were terming direct consumers, which is a throwback to the Schwartz and Bear 91 article that we actually reviewed quite recently. In these studies, they weren't usually looking at a comparison across intervention, like two totally different interventions, although there were a few of those, but a lot of them were looking at varying components of the same intervention. So for example, is an FR versus a VR for a token exchange more preferred? Or what were the communication modalities that were preferred within manned training as two specific examples? Or they were looking at preference for interventions to decrease targeted behavior instead. So those were the vast majority that they looked at were client preference arrangements. They also had a few examples of caregiver and staff preference arrangements. Rob, the one that you're going to touch on in a second was actually one of the 5 out of the 44 that fell into this category. These are also good to have, as they noted, because when we're thinking about social validity, we want to be evaluating what's preferred both for clients and for caregivers. And so it shouldn't be like, oh, client preference, we should be evaluating via concurrent chains arrangements. Caregiver preference, it's okay for us to keep using these social validity questionnaires because, again, like the say-do correspondence on what you say you're going to do or what you prefer on a questionnaire may or may not actually match up with what you select, which is, indicated as a better measure of preference. So they said, yeah, we should be doing both of these things basically. And then they looked at the procedural variations because even amongst these, 44 studies, there were a lot of variation in how they were utilizing the concurrent chains arrangements and things you kind of want to think about if you were going to go into this area yourself. So the first was, what are the initial link stimuli and how are they selected? So most studies used distinct stimuli that were relatively arbitrary, such as colors or shapes, and you just had to touch one for the initial link selection. 29% of these evaluated preference for the stimuli beforehand, and that can be a good idea because what if, for some reason, one of them is more preferred than the other, right? Some of them that wasn't relevant that they did this type of evaluation, but when they did do it, then they saw like a hierarchy or a preference. Then in some studies, they used the moderately preferred items or colors across all of the initial link selection stimuli. And then in other studies, they took the high preference item and assigned it to the control condition as like an extra buffer, right? So those are just things to think about. Next up, should you have a control condition? Including they went ahead and showed their hand here and said including a control condition is preferable because this allows you to distinguish between just indiscriminate responding across categories or if there truly is no preference. However, they noted that 36% of these studies did not include a control condition, and they went on and kind of divvied that up further and said it was not common, but also not uncommon that when they didn't have a control, they didn't end up identifying preference. So that's definitely something to think about. If you're going to include a control condition, you have to decide if it should operate like extinction, meaning that no responding, either appropriate or otherwise, is reinforced, or if it's going to be like a baseline condition where maybe the behavior targeted for decrease is reinforced. So make sure you think about that. Then next up, they said, what about how are you going to expose people to the different conditions? So should there be a guided exposure category and or should there be a discrimination test included? So you need to decide. In their sample, 66% of articles included a guided exposure trial, meaning they had the person select it and then experience it before they then did their own choice.
I like that.
Yeah.
I like that a lot.
Well, otherwise,
what do you don't know?
you might not know.
Right.
Exactly. Yes. However, even when they include those, it's still not known if the participant is discriminating between those options. So a few of the studies went further and did this thing called a discrimination test. In some of those studies, they asked the participant to vocally discriminate between the conditions. So they said, what happens when you get this token? But obviously not everyone is going to be able to do that. So then one study did a match the sample procedure as a discrimination test and needing to like match some aspect of the condition to the initial link stimulus. The importance of including this is that then you know with more certainty that the individual is discriminating amongst the conditions, but this already is a time-consuming process, and you have now added another layer to that. So, just tread carefully, I think, in determining where your resources should be most appropriately allocated. Mm-hmm. They said this was an important area for future research. Next up, think about how are you going to decide if once preference is established? Why are you making that face at me, Rob?
I just wanted to make that face. It's irrelevant. I just started making it and I decided to make it for fun.
Okay. Should there be criteria that will say, yes, now preference is established? Like Rob, you said before, you're like, and once you see responding occur, then preferences, then behold preference, right? But should there be an actual criteria in place?
No, they should just say, behold, preference.
Behold.
Arbitrarily, and then you're done.
So they said most of the studies do use the cumulative selections. A few of them just reported on like the overall, like which choice was overall selected more often. 6 of them did that. They cautioned against that because you might not know if the participant was really like waffling between the 2 choices all the way to the end and one just kind of came out on top a little bit. That would more indicate no clear preference than a preference. So better if you can show the cumulative selection. 11 of them, which was about 25%, had criteria that meant that preference was established. Of the ones that did that, one, for example, said that if they picked something 6 consecutive times, then it was the preferred one. And one said if they selected it 4 times more than the others, it was the preferred one. So those are some ideas for you. And then finally, they looked at ethical considerations. So, and we were all saying like, this is a good thing to do, right? But it doesn't mean that you might not get into some sticky situations once you've started to do this, because what happens if the participants appear to prefer a less effective intervention? Or what do you do if the participants seem to prefer, you've included the control condition like they told you to, and now the participant prefers no intervention? What do you do? Right?
Yeah.
What happens when the caregivers and the clients prefer different interventions? Now what do you do? So they present these as questions and then say, yes, we need to figure this out. So they do highlight for us that the right to choose is very important. The right to effective intervention is very important. So, of course, Bannerman et al. 1990 came back up in the context of this conversation. They also said maybe we should be thinking about the caregiver's views of acceptability of an intervention and the client's views on preference for an intervention to help us, out of this entanglement if we find ourselves there. And then the question of what if they prefer baseline or the control condition, they said, oh, yeah, we got to look into that. And that was the end of that conversation.
I can't remember if it was in this review or if it was in the Hanley 2010, the idea of, well, even if there's no agreement, knowing there's no agreement and knowing that there are preferences, you may be able to sort of smush up a treatment or get some more information about what are the sort of components that are disliked, and then you can kind of keep doing this procedure while making modifications until you sort of hit that happy medium of, look, everybody's happy. Although, again,
it wasn't in the study, so it probably was in yours. Okay. Tiger also has several studies where they have evaluated varying aspects, and sometimes kind of come up where they're like, oh, it turns out there is no clear preference here, so let's go with the more effective option. Or there was another one where they did that with the therapist, and it was looking at varying like TA prompting, I believe. And again, they were like, no clear option, no clear winner here, so let's just go with what seems to be easiest for the therapist, given that the client didn't prefer. Okay. So to round things out here, they said this really was not like we weren't determining best practice in the concurrent chains procedures. We were just looking at trends, but they do feel they can make a couple recommendations that map on like virtually exactly to Hanley 2010. So those include make sure you have a control condition. And number 2, if the caregiver and client preference are different, then maybe you need to modify what the intervention looks like so that there can
Everyone's happy.
Yes, exactly. And then finally, and this shouldn't really come as a surprise to anyone, make sure you're visually inspecting your data to see how the choices may change over time rather than just doing that overall percent selection. And after that, many of the things that came up in this article as like trends are things that people should be evaluating further in the future.
Beautiful.
Yeah. Thank you, Outen et al.
It's always nice to get those reviews. Mm-hmm. And from that review, we got one more article that we're going to only very briefly discuss. But part of it was because our listener choice episode for this spring is on consulting. And when looking at that great table, I did see a consulting article. It didn't really fit that episode, but I thought it also captured a lot of how you can use the concurrent chains arrangement in a way that's not like traditionally it's we've got a problem behavior, we're going to decrease problem behavior and teach an alternative function-based, alternative. And here's how we use, I've read a lot of those. And I sort of wanted to say, well, what does a skill acquisition concurrent chains arrangement look like? And then what does it look like in a situation where you probably could have just said, hey, because this is a consulting article working with teachers, hey, which of these do you like the best, and called it a day, because the individuals would have been able to share that information. So I thought, let's share that briefly. So I'm not going to go into all the details of the study. It was a kind of a multiple experiment study, really looking at what are the components of feedback that special education teachers in this sort of summer training program prefer when given the option. Do they prefer vocal feedback? Do they prefer video plus vocal or video plus written feedback? Or do they prefer written feedback or no feedback as the control option? And the study itself really was just sort of looking at feedback preferences, which again, the research tends to be kind of idiosyncratic. We know feedback is important. So as long as you were delivering some feedback with corrective feedback of what went wrong and what should be done instead, positive praise feedback where you're saying, here's all the good things you did right, you're doing it systematically, you're going to see an appropriate behavior change. But if you give people feedback they don't like, again, just like in any treatment, people may decide they don't want you to consult to them anymore. So the thought was, all right, well, let's take a look at these. Let's take a look at this. So just very briefly, they were looking at procedures like preference assessment procedures and prompting procedures in discrete trial training. That's what they were training in this kind of summer institute course. And they would sort of, pick and pair a feedback type with one of the training. So for example, for preference assessment, they were doing a forced choice versus an MSWO. And so, in the initial study, they were teaching them one preference assessment type would be paired with one type of feedback, either vocal or written in that experiment. And then when they came to sort of give the people the option of, which feedback type, they'd have a chance to have tried them both with the different trainings. And then they'd have sort of a new activity and say, hey, in this new activity, you get to pick. Do you want us to do written feedback, vocal feedback, or do you not want feedback? Which I think one person might have picked once, but mostly everyone picked a type of feedback that they wanted to have. So rather than just sort of asking them ahead of time, which is a good practice, they would then get to experience that feedback in that terminal link. So, okay, we're going to practice. We're going to do a role play. I'm going to give you feedback. Which feedback do you want? They'd pick it. They'd have the cards, just like in the study, but the cards would also have written instructions. Hey, this is what the written feedback will be. This is what the vocal feedback will be. They did all sorts of things like making sure that the feedbacks were equal. So, for example, written feedback and vocal feedback took the same amount of time. In vocal feedback, there was a chance to ask questions, which wasn't in the written feedback piece. So that was really one of the key differences. and kind of looking at that, what were the preferences of the teachers? So over time is repeating this, where did they show preferences? They also looked at how many trials did it take with each feedback type. So same idea. You could look at the efficacy of the different types of feedback, and then you could also look at the teacher preferences for the feedback. And they did 2 experiments. One was vocal and written, and kind of were the competing ones. The other experiment, that was with the DTT stuff, was with video feedback plus vocal or video feedback plus written. And again, for time, really condensing the components of this just down to the sort of the bare minimum of what you need to know. But kind of the patterns they would see, at least in that first, I'll go over the first study, is that usually you'd see, one feedback type being slightly better than the other, but not always. And it didn't seem like the one that turned out to be the best form of feedback in terms of efficiency of training was not always the most preferred form of feedback. Sometimes written would be better for some folks. Sometimes it would be, vocal would be more preferred. And that's just through the concurrent chains arrangement. Because after they sort of did this, and they did the same thing with the video, and they saw that, sometimes video plus vocal was better, sometimes it was written, sometimes it was just the vocal feedback. It was a little different for every participant, which again, you see a lot in the research. But then after that, they looked at, all right, but what if we do just a typical social validity survey? So they know which feedback type taught the skill the fastest. They know which feedback type in using the concurrent chains arrangement was most preferred in terms of you picked it, you did it. And now they're going to find out, when I ask you the question, which of these feedback types do you think is the most acceptable? Which feedback type do you think is the best? Which one would you tell other people to do? And then rank these feedback types by like best to the worst. Let's look at those results. And again, the interesting part here is the results weren't always the same. There wasn't always agreement with what the teachers actually chose when given the option, to which they said they preferred the most, which is funny because I know in Hanley you talked about how, one's values as, the therapist might not be the same as the individual, but it's funny to think that one's values as the person learning something might not be the same as the stated values of the person. So the values you want to live and experience are not necessarily corresponding to the values you state, values being a very broad term in this example. So in social validity surveys, vocal was pretty much always scored as the most acceptable type of feedback, and then vocal plus video, and then sort of written. However, that wasn't always the most effective form of feedback, nor was it always the feedback that was chosen by all of the participants. Sometimes written was faster, right? Sometimes written was more preferred, but everyone loves vocal, even though it wasn't the best feedback by those other measures in other times.
I don't want vocal feedback.
No, I never want vocal feedback.
See, as someone who works and consults in schools, when I suggest we're going to do a role play, knowing that getting feedback and practicing and being able to sort of give vocal feedback to performance, it is like shut down. No one wants to be part of your training anymore. Let's move this along. You are treating me like a baby. I hate this.
Yeah.
And people just won't do. And that's not 100%, but I've had people who are just I hate this and this sucks and your training is now bad. Mm-hmm. And as much as you tell them, no, research says that you're not going to learn to do this if I don't do these role plays with you, does not seem to change people's opinion on it. It's weird. There's something, I think it's big learning history. It might be time, it might be access. Some people said they did like written feedback because they could refer to it later. Some people said they liked the vocal and video because they could kind of see what's going on and explain what's happening. Half of them said, if they could choose, and again, they could choose, and they didn't choose this one, but a combo of vocal and written, which was not an option. Some people said they really like. So again, a lot of things that we need to look at in terms of feedback, but
I feel like you could also get to these same answers based on if you ask the people, have you ever considered being in an improv group?
It's funny.
So I don't know, very strange that everyone loves vocal, yet it was not necessarily the most chosen feedback, and it certainly wasn't the most useful feedback.
Which one was most useful?
I mean, it varied for every participant.
It's idiosyncratic,
yeah,
Diana.
It was sort of let's see, going back to the first experiment, which is written versus vocal. That was a pretty simple one. One teacher was faster with written feedback, but liked vocal. One did the same with both of them, but really liked written feedback. One actually did better with vocal feedback and also then preferred vocal. Okay. One did both, but preferred vocal.
Okay.
One didn't have a preference.
Sorry, I asked.
No, I mean, those are the results. It's here are all the participants, and here is the different response that every single one had. So
I'll go talk to Amy Henley.
That's why I didn't go into too many details. It's just interesting how different all of these measurements could be within the same individual. So I think, that points to a lot, and we'll talk more about consulting in a later episode, but really how this arrangement is important, but it also might not be the full answer to what does the client prefer, because what the client chooses may not be what the client states they would like to choose.
I feel like you're like really teetering on the edge of an existential question about how does one see themselves versus how does one want to be seen versus how one actually is. So we need to back it up before we all go over the edge.
All right, well.
How about we back it up right into dissemination station?
Let's do it. I almost
can you
was
do
gonna
a
say-
reverse train?
That sounds. Ugh. No. That's a real something's
it'd be
gone
like,
wrong.
Oh yeah, that's better.
That's just the same. That's just the same sound.
In reverse.
Oh, and just with the sh part.
There you go. Either one, you choose.
Okay, you get to pick.
You get to pick which one you like.
Yeah, we're gonna put a button in the podcast player. You got to click to see which one you get.
Make sure you include a control, which is I hate all of this.
Yeah.
It's just silence. All right. Either way, we're in dissemination station. I was going to actually just put that study in dissemination station, but I thought it would kind of miss the point. So I think
You have
concurrent
derailed.
chains arrangement is fascinating stuff. My question is, it does feel like one of those things you sort of read that BAP article and you're like, oh, I could do this now. I could probably run this now. Is, when would be times that you might not run this? And then how do you build this in? So certainly if you're billing insurance, can you bill for doing concurrent chains
It's
arrangements
assessment.
as part of assessment? Like that would count, even though it is like, well, I did the FA and I know this treatment should work by the
I don't
literature.
know. We're really not a billing podcast.
That's why it's a question.
Yeah.
I'm just asking questions.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you can always find a way to bill most things,
Yeah.
right? As long as
We're not experts in this
But we
area.
are
Please
not.
do not
No.
No.
take any of our recommendations.
Yes. No. Yes. I like to think, certainly if you were in a private clinic, this would be something that you could probably put pretty quickly into your practice. And I think you could even come up with some sort of special ways to sort of weigh the results. So if you're getting different results from stakeholder versus client versus verbal choice versus concurrent chains choice, you could probably come up with some sort of algorithm of like, and from that, this is the treatment and this is why we're doing it this way. I mean, or you could have the time to sort of fine tune everything to make everyone happy. For folks in schools, unless you're in specialized program, I think it's going to be very hard to find the time to do these things, even in like your training programs, skill acquisition programs. There's a value in it, I think, though, for a school, because you're talking about, but if you get these preferences might be stable for a long time. We're talking about treatments that might be in place for years and years. Right. So wouldn't it be better to spend the time and know, the client loves this treatment option. So as we use it for the next 2 or 3 or 4 years, we don't have to worry about them being like, God, I hate this setting. I want to have problem behavior to get the heck out of here, right? That kind of escape maintained behavior. We don't want that. But again, a lot of organizations, it is very hard to explain the longer, later reason that you're spending all the time on a situation when the problem just needs to get resolved as fast as possible.
But there is significant value, I think, in finding ways to ask our clients what it is that they prefer. And this is a way to do that. It's not always easy, but we're also then like establishing that history for them too. Of I get to choose, I get to select, and this is a process by which I can do that. That's to me invaluable, and this is a potentially cusp skill that one can. Maybe you need to start here for a learner who cannot tell you, but maybe down the road this can evolve into. Let me just tell you what I want and what I prefer. Because you now have that history, right? So like this is just another area to me where it's critical that we're offering choice and finding ways to ensure that our clients know that that what they have to say is valued.
Provide choice now and forever. It gets easier to assess choice as time goes on because the individual expects that and knows how to make that choice known in different ways. Yeah.
Yes.
Very true. It may be longer, later skill, but I think you're right, Dinah. Choice has cusp is really what we want to be thinking about. And the procedure itself, not that hard. All right. Any other dissemination facts, or should we move on into, and by everyone's facial expressions, let's move on into pairings.
Yay.
Oh, we're not adding that sound, are we? Let's put some more mouth sounds onto the show.
No. I'm going to select the white button on that one. Pairings is the time in which I tell you about other episodes you might want to check out if you thought that this one was interesting. And I have a few to recommend. So I would like to take us all the way back to episode 9, which was just titled Choice. And we talked about choice with Dr. Alan Carcina in that one, so you can check that out. In episode 57, which we titled Do Humans Prefer Contingencies? Quite similarly ripping off the Luzinski and Hanley article, Do Children Prefer Contingencies? Much as Catania ripped off Frost. We review some of this early literature as well. You definitely want to check that one out. In episode 90, we talked about social validity. In episode 270, we talked very recently about assessing social validity in more depth. In episode 189, we talked about self-control. And Rob, you even brought that language up just now, smaller, sooner, larger, later. So that's why I threw that in there. And then finally, in episode 273, again, quite recently, we talked about schedule thinning. That one's there because we did a review at the beginning of that episode on varying types of compound schedules of reinforcement. Mm-hmm. And then if you also would like to have a snack while you listen to these episodes, then of course I am going to recommend to you one of two things: a plate with just one single red M&M on it, or another plate with multiple red M&Ms on it, from which you can also pick one. And you know which one you're going to select?
The multiple.
You got it.
I won't, because I know what you're trying to make me do.
Oh no, counter control has reared
that.
its ugly head. Yeah, so if you remember, I know I talked about it before, but Tiger et al. 2006, one of my favorite studies, they did exactly this, and you are totally right, Jackie. Even though you still only get one red M&M, you get to pick which one you take, and that is why we know that choice is preferred.
All right. Well, thank you, Dinah and Jackie, for joining me on this concurrent chains arrangement journey. And that brings us to the end of our episode. Thank you all very much for listening. If you have not, please subscribe to ABA Inside Track on whatever podcast platform you like to use. You can find us online as ABA Inside Track. You can find us on socials as that. You can go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, to find links to all of our previous episodes, to find links to the articles discussed in this episode, as well as to purchase CEs. And speaking of that, you probably want our second secret code word. It is PARTY. PARTY, because I got a... What's that for? Them the mask, I think.
I don't know.
What's happening?
Okay. Party is the code.
We like to rock the party.
Yeah,
we've been watching Flight of the Conchords.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's party, whichever reference you prefer. And if you want even more references, why not subscribe on our Patreon page?
Ain't no party like my Nana's tea party.
Patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, where you can subscribe at whatever level. You can subscribe at the free level, but at the $5 and $10 levels is where you start getting to make lots of extra choices and get extra access to free not free episodes, but free CEs, including for our listener choice episodes, which this spring, when this episode comes out, is coming up very shortly, is going to be on consulting, which we haven't talked about in a while. And you also, at the $10 level, can get our quarterly book club podcast, where we talk for 2 hours about a book in the field voted on by listeners. This summer, we're actually going to do a summer of book clubs because we had so many books that we wanted to read. Some voted on by listeners, some we had some special guests, and some we just wanted to read because we felt like it. So this is a great time if you haven't checked us out on patreon.com/ABA Inside Track to get all of those right when they come out, rather than waiting a whole year, which is when we release them to everybody else. And you want to be in the know.
Will any of them be Oprah book club books?
No, they have to be related to behavior analysis, okay. And she's not, I believe, picked any of those. So.
Okay.
Oh, well. Also, some final thanks. Thanks to Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro and outro music, Kyle Sturry for our interstitial music, and Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for his amazing editing work. We'll be back next week with another fun-filled episode. Until then, keep responding. Bye.
Bye.